Just for the record, I've defined local as things basically between Minnesota and New Orleans. So many of the examples I'm going to use can be scaled down to a city level. I didn't want to embarrass anybody by using their own ditch project as an example, so just scale down. And I'm going to be pretty loose about the format. We're going to cover a lot of different topics rather quickly, and I think you'll get the main idea. What resources are important? This is a question that's dominated American politics for quite a while. In fact, Western culture seems to think oil is the most important resource. But basically, when you get right down to it, it's water, soil, the biota, and the air, which are all necessary if we're going to survive as a species. And on many occasions, I've thought about the progression of the environmental movement before it was called environment. And some of the first regulatory actions were taken on air pollution when the cities in the late 1800s discovered that it was very difficult to breathe with all of the new factories burning coal and wood with no controls whatsoever. Then we got into water pollution control big time in the 20s. We've been nervous about soil erosion since the Dust Bowl in this country. And in the last 50 years, we've gotten serious about trying to protect some of our biota. All those are important. And if you recall, it was about 15 years ago that there was worldwide interest in water because people were suddenly thinking that water was important, maybe even as important as oil. And I had a conversation with a Saudi emir of some sort a while back where he finally admitted that soil was more valuable than oil. So part of what we're going to talk about today in terms of local sustainability is trying to preserve our ability to have sufficient soil and water to sustain ourselves both as a country and probably more importantly, if we get into a real problem, is can we make it locally? There's a multidisciplinary approach needed to a lot of sustainability issues these days that people are finally beginning to grasp, and that is that almost everything is connected to something else. And there are temporal and spatial relationships between various engineering and restoration and other projects that need to be considered ahead of time, and frequently it takes an engineer, a biologist, and a soils person to put something together. There are chemical and biological interactions that were never thought of before, particularly things like what happens to your drugs after you flush them down the toilet. There are species interactions involving newly introduced viruses like West Nile, birds, people, and a variety of other things. Of course, there's always the engineering and structural considerations when you do something to the environment, because it might fall down or wash away if you do it wrong, or it might kill something important if you do it right in the wrong place. And there are economic and social considerations. What one person considers a good idea, someone else is going to consider a bad idea. And it's very difficult to get anything done in the United States today because all these different interest groups are trying to defend what they perceive as their turf. Who's right or wrong is not necessarily the issue at the moment. I've been fortunate to be involved with the surveys in one form or another since I was a sophomore in high school and discovered that they knew something about bugs over at Natural History Survey. And Illinois is fortunate to have scientific units which do basic research and applied research on what's important to the biota, the air, the water, the land, and the human interface with all of those resources. And that's now known as the Institute of Natural Resource Sustainability within the University of Illinois. These are the people, including the Sustainable Technology Center right here, who can help address a lot of the major issues with scientific data. How are decisions made? As we're finding out locally with any number of projects that are going on, it's very complex these days. But you can have an executive decision in some cases, a legislative or a regulatory decision. Sometimes special interests come in through the back door. Special interests can be both the environmental and the economic interests. corporate owners can do something. This is happening worldwide, with many of the resources on other continents being appropriated or expropriated with certain political sanction by a variety of interests that are taking timber and other resources out of the third world. And then, of course, you've got individual owners who in many parts of the world, including the United States, can do almost whatever they want with whatever is considered their property. What about wise sayings? These all apply in some way to the issue of sustainability, resource conservation, etc. Little things like, don't put all your eggs in one basket. How many times have you seen a yard with only one species of grass? And that would be a turf grass. Don't throw it away, you never know when you're going to need it. How many species are we losing a week worldwide? Everything has a place and everything in its place. All things in moderation would be a good one. We'll come to that in a bit. And God didn't make no junk. I forget what movie that's from, but basically it goes to the issue of species being eliminated and various resources being totally used up all at once as if they had no importance. Back in the old days, I was an entomologist. In 1968, I was hired full-time by the Natural History Survey in the summer to run around the state collecting bees and ants and mecopter and a few other things. In the process, I was put on a side project and became the state marijuana collector, which probably got me more attention at that time than just about anything else. But the bottom line is, for several summers, I had a state car from the Natural History Survey and a credit card and a license to go anywhere and collect insects. And I literally went all over the state. I've been on just about every back road you can think of. I can't remember their names anymore, obviously. But it gave me an appreciation for nature that few people get, because among other things, once I turned on what was a sound gravel road in a blind spot and found myself up to my hubcaps, all four tires in mud, and it took me the rest of the day to dig myself out. This publication probably changed my life. When I was a freshman, I read this publication, and it talks about what man did to the Illinois River. I could not believe what I was reading, and I won't say much more about it. Landsat, and I'm going to use a lot of pictures and things from the old days. These are not gussied up with modern technology too much. This is a grainy Landsat photo, probably copied 4 times from a slide, of central Illinois. I used this many times in the 70s when I dealt with various water projects. Champaign is here, Allerton Park is there. The Umbra River works its way down here. Of course, the Middle Fork and Danville are over this way. The Middle Fork and Oakley Dams got a lot of people involved in conservation here in Illinois, and particularly the local area. But what you should notice here is all the gray. That is all prime farmland, basically in corn and beans. The shaded areas are what remained at that time of the wooded areas. There just aren't very many in our part of the state. Now, as you get down closer to ground level, you're in a small plain now. This is the Umbra River, not too far from Villa Grove. You can see there is a tiny band of trees, but not a whole lot of habitat there. From the river itself, you might think you're in a pristine wilderness. So the important thing to consider here is the scale, and how important to any bird or insect or animal that depends on trees and the ability to move from point A to point B for mating and other purposes like spreading your genes around, those little tree corridors might be. And we'll talk a lot about corridors as we go along. Here's another telling slide. This is from the Allerton Park Committee. This is Allerton Park. And notice there's a difference in the trees. This is a diversity type slide. The floodplain species are still green. The upland hardwoods are turning their leaves. This is a very good illustration of biological diversity. There's different species in different places, so we need to keep the places if we're going to keep the species. Here's a slide done by my good friend Rip Sparks. He's a rivers biologist, very capable individual. He analyzed the historic data on flood heights and water heights on the Illinois River in the late 1800s and from 1975 to 96. Historically, before settlement got to altering the landscape too awful much, the Illinois River basically had a flood pulse in the spring and a little one in the fall. All of the native species, both plant and animal in the area, are adapted to this flood pulse. After settlement, cities got built, streams got channelized, etc. The river became what we call flashy. And this is true of the boneyard. It's true of the gutter in front of your house and most of the rivers in the Midwest, if not the whole country. It applies to traffic too. But you'll notice instead of a pulse and then a rather gentle summer and fall, it's up and down all the time. As a practical matter, that means that species along the river that used to live on the flood plain, they very seldom get a year when they can grow. This is true of areas below hydropower dams. It's true of pump storage and a whole lot of other things where you have a flush of water going down a stream. If you've got constant pulses, you've interrupted the habitat to the point where a lot of the plants and animals that would normally be there are either stressed or extirpated. Here's what happens with the flood pulses. Every time the little plants get started, the river comes up and kills them most years. Here's what's happened to the various species of ducks. This one is a lesser scaup, but the same thing is true of most species. On the Illinois and Mississippi, the Natural History Survey has kept records for decades. You can see at one time on the Mississippi River, this species was very well established. It's been on a downhill slide. Prior to that, it was dominant on the Illinois River. And as the river was degraded, it went down, they moved to the Mississippi, and now I'm not sure where they are. Transportation is an important thing for Illinois, and remember Champaign-Urbana has 3 major interstates coming through it, which means in terms of a whole lot of issues, Illinois is the transportation hub of the nation. The railroads initially went through Chicago and St. Louis, both of which are here. 6 of the 4 east-west interstates go through Illinois. You cannot get from New York to Texas or Seattle in a truck or a train without passing through Illinois, unless you want to waste a whole lot of fuel going around the horn. But anyway, these transportation corridors are very good for us economically. They also provide corridors for a variety of invasive species to enter the state and other species to leave the state. Additionally, it's worth considering how we subsidize the various forms of transportation. There are some things that should move by rail, some things that should move by truck, some things that should move by barge, and some things which are ambiguous. Without belaboring the point, that entire economic sensibility of transportation has been upset by subsidies, which in turn affect the rivers and the highways. Now, back in the late 60s, this report came out, Upper Mississippi River Basin Study. It was a combined effort of most of these federal and state agencies. What did they recommend? I remember this was back in the days when we thought we had a lot of money. Well, every one of these red dots, which I put on this map, is a major Corps of Engineer reservoir that was planned for the Upper Mississippi Basin, which starts at Cairo and goes up into Wisconsin and over to South Dakota, Iowa, etc. Every dot is a dam, sort of like Carlisle or Shelbyville. They were all planned to be built by 2020, which is fairly soon. That came into another saying we used to hear from Mom, enough is enough. As you can see, the blue dots or splotches are existing reservoirs at that time. All these were planned. Throughout the watershed, the Soil Conservation Service had this map in there. Every one of these red or blue areas is a small watershed that had a PL 566, that's Public Law 566, or other project planned for it. And there were over 10,000 miles of stream channelization in that plan, dozens of small reservoirs, holding ponds, etc. Here's just one little watershed of that in southern Illinois. Every one of these marks is a project in the big muddy watershed. There were so many down there because Congressman Kenny Gray was a senior member of the Appropriations Committee, and this is a 9-foot deep canoe path which was planned, which would also accommodate barges, by the way. But you can see what we were up against in the late 60s and early 70s when the Committee on the Middle Fork, the Allerton Park Committee, and the others were formed to try and stop some of this before every river in the state was done. Now, I think of rivers like highways, and the transportation engineers should get together with the hydrologists sometime and figure out that a highway is built very large because you have to accommodate rush hour traffic. A river's floodplain is the equivalent of the 6 lanes in Chicago you don't need at 4 in the morning because there aren't many cars. You need those lanes when you've got a lot of traffic at rush hour. The same is true of the rivers, but people haven't got that through their heads yet. Here's Carlisle Dam. This is an example of one of the 104 that were planned for the upper Mississippi. It had a lot of unforeseen circumstances, not the least of which the native soil couldn't support constant pounding by waves, and these multi-hundred-year-old oak trees used to be out here. This area was eroding at about 10 feet a year for a while. Corps of Engineers put rock on the shoreline to try and protect it, and the rock washes away. Like with a highway, when you stop traffic on a road and it backs up, it takes a while for it to get going again. When you do a major dam, either a great big one out in the countryside or a little pond of some sort in town, when you hold the water back, you've got to let it go. Without belaboring the point, the farmers downstream of most of the major reservoirs in the Midwest have worse flooding than they did before, not so much because the water's deep, but because it takes so long to get the water out that the river's full for a very long time, which means the fields don't drain and the tiles don't drain. Here's a classic photo taken by the same guy who took the picture of the dead students at Kent State, John Philo. It's in Governor Walker's office. These two gentlemen are talking to the governor's senior aide. It's a real live pitchfork. You couldn't do this today, but we did it then. This picture was in just about every daily newspaper in the country in 1974. Here's a channelization project, big time. This is the Kaskaskia River when the Corps was putting in the barge canal. Here's the Missouri River about 1947. It's nice and wide. All this is publicly owned land. Here it is about 1960. It's been channelized with wing dikes. What used to be public water surface is now given to the local landowners, and we've lost the river. Here's a shot on the Umbra showing a little meander. Here's a shot on the Skillet Fork showing a similar meander after the river was improved. They channelized straight through the meanders. The cutoffs ultimately are filled in and farmed. Every tree is cut down. The banks begin to erode wildly. And when it rains, the soil washes away. It's not a very good idea. They're still doing this in some parts of the state, like occasionally on the Salt Fork. It's not as prevalent as it used to be, but this is what was happening. When we do something up here, it affects people in Minnesota, Canada, and the Gulf. The wildlife that migrates from Canada and the north, they stop over in places in Illinois and Iowa to feed on their trips north and south. Then they go down to the Gulf of Mexico and they try to breed or overwinter. And what's happened down there is the delta is eroding away. All the red on this slide was land 40 years ago, marsh land. It's gone partly because the sediment that used to feed and restore the delta is being trapped behind reservoirs all over the upper Mississippi Basin. What little does get down there, and it's half as much as was documented in the 1700s, it is shot out into the Gulf of Mexico and wasted because the Corps of Engineers navigation channels it right out. Surface water and erosion, you're familiar with agricultural erosion in Illinois, but the data show that agriculture is only about half. Urban areas and stream banks and beds provide a lot as well. Here's a roadside. It's in Macoupin County, so nobody locally has to worry. But you can see this wasn't taken care of very well, and all that erosion is going down Macoupin Creek and ultimately into the Mississippi. The sediment is collecting in reservoirs all over the Midwest. In fact, it's a worldwide issue. This is the Illinois River in 1903. This would have been the 5-foot depth contour throughout Peoria Lake, which is a 20-mile reach from Peoria to Chillicothe. By 1982, the Water Survey had documented that there was so much mud in the lakes that only this narrow band was at least 5 feet deep. In fact, you cannot find a place on the Illinois River system that's more than 2 feet deep at normal pool, except where there's a maintained recreation channel. Here are some, I think those are egrets. They're standing in water. That's in the middle of a pool that's about a half-mile across. One thing we've done here at the center, in conjunction with the Water Survey and Geosurvey, and even some help from natural history, is we've been piloting a project to see if you can take the sediment from a reservoir or a big lake and use it as topsoil. The basic answer is yes. Here's some coming out of the truck. I first talked about this idea with the Water Survey's Mr. Roberts back in 1969. He had a little project where a dredge was being used at Carlinville, and he was trying to use it as topsoil. A union dispute ended that experiment. But this idea goes back a long time. Here you can see mud that's been out of the river less than a day being put on top of the Pekin landfill as final cover. This chunk of soil with the associated root structure was on the bottom of Peoria Lake a year before this picture was taken. You can see the soil developed soil structure extremely quickly. We threw grass seed on it, and in March, and it had that type of root structure by September. Shifting gears a little bit, when I was at Pollution Control Board, because I was an entomologist, I had a background that most of our members didn't have. The state at that time had an invasive species coming in called Aedes albopictus. It came in on scrap tires from Japan. In 1987, it was found in a couple places in Texas and Louisiana, as well as Hawaii and a few other spots. By 1988, it was in Chicago and the places you see. It was being transported by tires in an egg. When it rained, the tires got wet, the eggs hatched. This was tied in with another problem. At that time, scrap tires were a major issue in Illinois. It was a major landscape issue because we had over 100 million scrap tires scattered around Illinois. Almost every alley in Chicago had tires. Most cities had tires. Farms, like this farm field here, trucks would come in at night and dump loads of tires. There were piles in places like Iroquois County and Pembroke Township. There are 1 million tires in this pile. Now, this was a huge landscape issue, a huge public health issue once these new mosquitoes got in, because Aedes albopictus can spread 26 viral diseases. We're lucky when West Nile came in, it wasn't very bad for people, because if these mosquitoes that are spreading West Nile had picked up something serious from the east, we could have had something like dengue fever or worse going all through the American population. As was, we lost most of our blue jays, a good number of our crows and others. So these are serious issues. The Great Chicago Tire Fire of 1989 happened exactly the time I was pushing the rule on scrap tires and mosquitoes through the Pollution Control Board. It shut down Interstate 57. It terminated part of the 8th and 9th innings of a White Sox game where Governor Thompson was present. That helped us get this through the legislature. Firefighters were present for 2 weeks trying to put that fire out. These tires were everywhere. I don't know if we had a tire fire in Champaign County or not, but I know we had them in several local counties. We put together a project with political support from the governor and the tire dealers that basically solved the problem. When you go to get a new tire and you pay $1 or $2 for a disposal, it's paying for these cleanups. Now, Governor Blagojevich kind of gutted the program on the research side, but it does still provide money to the Natural History Survey for mosquito studies. This became one of EPA's most popular programs because the money generated by that tire fund picked up tires all over the state. Some counties actually had competition to see which county could pick up the most tires in a month. Another thing worth noting is that lead in gasoline was taken out of gasoline about 1972. It was discovered because the highway right-of-ways, particularly in urban areas, had a lot of lead in them. That was discovered when the great cats at a zoo close to an interstate started getting sick, and it was lead poisoning. They finally figured out that the air was being polluted and it was depositing. And this is a positive thing on environment. Since gasoline lost its lead, the blood lead levels in children in the U.S. have gone down dramatically. Okay, now we'll come to a more local situation. This is a new subdivision somewhere in Champaign County. I'm really offended by a lot of the ads the developers have for their subdivisions. I call it Beautiful Prairie Meadow Homestead Glen, which gives you an idea of the type of names that are used for these things. And here's a farm field next to a local version of that. You can see the soil probe out here by Dr. Darmody's students shows a pretty nice dark soil going down about 18 inches. This is what a nearby area in Champaign County looks like during the pre-development. All of the topsoil has been scraped off the land and piled up, and everything is gone. The soil insects, the soil bacteria, the nutrients, it's all piled up somewhere. Then the houses get built. This is also Champaign County. I won't say which village or city, but look at the grass sod was rolled out on top of this stuff. And we've got pictures where it was rolled out basically on clay and gravel. There's not going to be a whole lot of ecological value to this. It's not going to absorb much moisture. It's not going to help much with rainfall events. And somebody's going to have to water the grass a whole lot because the roots don't have anywhere to go. Here's a yard in another subdivision in Champaign County. Gravel, lots of clay material, and the grass is extremely patchy. Here are cores taken in yards. This is one yard, but I think we took cores in about, how many do, Janway? About 12 yards in Champaign County in new subdivisions. This one has maybe an inch of topsoil and then clay. You can tell by looking at these, this is not your typical Central Illinois black dirt. And I always thought that when somebody buys a house locally, they have a presumptive right to at least a foot of good topsoil. This is Central Illinois, the best topsoil in the world. This is not Appalachia or deep southern Illinois. So that's an issue that needs to be considered. Where does the topsoil go? Well, somebody typically sells it or throws it away as daily cover at landfills. They don't want to fool with it. It's much easier to build on the subsoil than it is on the topsoil. So in many cases it doesn't get put back. Some places will put 6 inches down, which compacts down to 4. But basically we're losing our soil, and I believe soil is more important than oil, and this whole issue is going to come back and bite us. Not only what we're doing in subdivisions, but what we're doing out in the country as a whole, and the situation is worldwide. Someday we're going to need to grow something, and there's not going to be anything to grow. Another thing that's going on that's very bad environmentally and affects our ability to sustain species, and at this point I'll say that one of the things I say a lot when I give talks in the Chicago area is I would like to see a day when our kids, particularly in the cities, think of wildlife in terms of something other than squirrels, pigeons, and rats. Because that is literally the only wildlife that many children in America and other parts of the world see. Because there's no habitat left for anything else. Here's a woods. You know, everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, a whole lot of people want to go live in the woods and out in the country these days. The first thing a lot of them do, particularly if they're a developer developing a wooded glen, they scrape away all the understory, kill all the woodland wildflowers, scrape away all the soil fauna, the fungi, etc., and they leave a handful of trees, and you end up with something like this. Here's a nice lot. This is woods used to go on across. This isn't Champaign County, by the way, but if you go along the Sangamon or the Salt Fork, you'll see this all over the place. People get rid, they want to live in the woods, but they get rid of all the understory, most of the wildflowers, and I've seen on the Sangamon where people have basically cut down most of the trees so they can see the water, and they try to plant grass. And it's defeating the purpose. if you like the woods, don't kill them. How many park districts do something similar? When I was doing my work in the 60s, this was a very common sight. A fence row along a farm area, field on both sides, grasses, trees, and a variety of things in there. That doesn't look like much, but if you're an insect or a bird, that's your habitat. It sustains you. In the wintertime in particular, you can tell that it provides a microclimate or a microhabitat. What's going on out here in terms of temperature and soil moisture and compaction is different than what is going along on the fence line. And a lot of critters can live here, particularly through the summer and winter, that can't live over here where it's plowed. There's a more typical scene you see today. This is down in Macoupin County where I did my bee study. Spraying. Railroads and highways and river corridors used to be the primary place where our native plants, birds, insects, and reed butterflies in that used to be able to make a living despite what the farmers were doing in the adjacent fields. More and more, as I drive around the state, railroads are spraying quite a ways out from the track, killing the native plants. And here you can see this tree, if you look at it closely, this side of the tree is dead. People are now putting things in their yards. Our children are being taught that any insect is bad. Listen to the ads for lawn care these days. They talk about how the ant in your yard might get in your house. Well, most of the ants in your yard have no interest in your house. They, especially the native species, they're basically a prairie or woodland species. They're not going to go eat your sugar or steal your graham crackers. But the companies now will come in to do lawn care. They will apply a herbicide, an insecticide, as well as fertilizer. And that is causing a lot of trouble. Because a lot of our birds depend on the soil insects. Most people think of bees as honeybees and bumblebees. In truth, back in my Macoupin County study, there were over 300 different species of bees. Honeybee was one. There were 10 bumblebees. The rest were these guys, little native bees that are wild. Some of them live in stems and sticks. A lot of them live in the ground. Now, this is my old house on Nevada Street. That's one of the neighbor kids. Every one of these little piles of dirt is a bee nest constructed by a single female who digs down there, lays her eggs, provisions the nest with pollen and nectar, and then goes away and dies. Think of how much soil is turned over by these. And when our park districts and our neighborhoods are constantly sprayed, these guys have trouble making a living. You can see them underground. Native plants, or just diverse plantings, are essential if we're going to maintain our bird life, our butterflies, our bees, and a whole host of other organisms. Particularly if global warming kicks in the way some people fear it will, there's going to have to be migrations of birds, insects, and plants. A lot of the insects don't fly like monarchs. They crawl, or they can only fly a quarter to a half mile. A lot of the plants, their seeds don't blow. They have to be carried by an ant or some other critter, or they have to tumble around on the ground or get hooked up with a deer in order to move. So we need, going back to the idea of corridors, which we'll talk about again in a minute, we need to have plants in our parks, in our yards, in our highway rights-of-way, and hopefully the farmers will pick up this idea too, and we'll get some native plants, be they prairie or woodland, depending on the habitat. This is my old front yard. Early in the spring, you'll see a variety of plants blooming. Here it is about 6 weeks later, a different group of plants are blooming. Some support birds, some support bees, some support flies. But it's not a bad thing to do. Here's a yard in Urbana. There's a little planting here which includes wildflowers, non-native ornamentals, and others. The bottom line is the owner is happy with a variety of plants. Some are useful to bees, some are useful to butterflies, some are ornamental, and they've still got a lot of grass. Here's a nice planting of, I know the city of Urbana did it, but this is a coneflower, etc. It's along Vine Street. It provides a lot of pollen and nectar to bees and butterflies during the summer. It could be improved a little bit if there were some plants in that bloomed in the fall, late fall and early spring. But this is an excellent beginning for the city. And if this was done in more places, we'd have a better chance of getting some survivorship. This is a Wisconsin shot I took last week. But here's a roadside. Up there they've got a lot of scrubby land, but this little piece of roadside is pretty wild. There's about 6 species of plants there that support a number of insect bees. Now here's some plants that will grow in Urbana. These are all plants that I've grown for years. Spring beauty, it comes up early in the spring. It'll come up in a lawn with oak trees that are shady. It supports 58 different kinds of bees, and there's 9 butterflies and moths on it. It's totally gone by the end of June, and the grass grows. Here's another plant, Jacob's ladder, grows very well in Urbana shaded yards. 38 different species of bees are found on it, 5 species of butterflies, and a variety of other things. Astropelosis, which is in bloom now in the fall, 90 species of bees, 54 other hymenoptera, 119 flies, and 30 different butterflies and moths use this plant. Bottom line is, if plants like this are used in city plantings and encouraged in yards, you're going to have several benefits, including we will maintain some of the bees, birds, and butterflies and other insects that belong here. They weren't junk. Here's another plant. This is a very popular one, a coneflower. There's about 20-some species of bees, a whole lot of butterflies and other insects use it. It's very popular in yards. Planting these plants make good projects. The Urbana Park District has had family outings twice where at least 60 people have showed up to put wildflowers in Carl Park. Here's a Girl Scout troop planting plants out of my yard at the Pollinatarium. Highways, very important corridors. Somehow in the last 30 or so years, the management companies have convinced farmers that they need to mow all their right-of-way. As you drive around the state today versus when I did almost 40 years ago, there aren't many plants along the side of the road other than turf-type plants. There's places like this, which I consider very good, where just the edge of the road is mowed. That's a good idea for safety. But you don't really need to mow all the way up to the farmland. This is along an interstate. These are IDOT prairie planting. Here's another interstate. I think this is Route 80. All these prairie plants were planted. The highway department hasn't got the expertise or the money to maintain them as well as they should, but there's a lot of progress been made in a lot of areas. One of the problems, though, is without a lot of resources, they're reverting to the lowest common denominator in some areas, which is basically a lot of mowing. You can get trees to grow in some of these public lands. This is a big interchange. I can't remember whether this is Champaign or Sangamon County, but there's a variety of trees growing in this intersection. A typical intersection has, the clover leaf is 80 acres. There's a lot of room there where you could put trees that need to grow for 100 or 200 years and probably won't be bothered much. You have to be able to tolerate some salt, and you don't want to put in things that will encourage deer. But basically, there's a lot of public land. Highway rights-of-way are one. It can be very important for a whole range of organisms, particularly insects and birds, that are having trouble finding a place to live these days. Prairies are frequently burned. You can burn a prairie along a highway. Just have to be a little bit careful, and if they're worried about smoke, you could shut the highway down for a few minutes, like they do whenever there's an accident or something, or they're doing a little bit of work, and do a burn and be done with it. This is Oak Street, not too far from here. Invasive species are an interesting topic. I often say a lot of our invasive plants are just like a Persian phalanx coming in. Now note the little hats, because you're going to see them again. This is teasel. Note the little hats. Comes in like a friendly neighbor. It's an invasive, I think, from Asia. A couple seeds get spread. Usually, we think by a mowing machine or possibly a bird, but these seeds don't travel very far on their own. They have to be carried. Here's some milkweed. This is a no-mow area, but there's some native forbs in there and a lot of grasses. I don't think this is a native grass, but it's still grass that's higher than 6 inches, which is good. The next year, notice there's little ones growing here. These plants cover the ground. These babies, the first year, their leaves spread out and smother adjacent plants. The next year, you'll have something that looks like this. The next year, well, not the next year, but after about 5 or 6 years, they not only leave the highway right away, but they get into any unimproved ground nearby. Notice the little Persian hats. But it's a terrible problem because these plants are not good for almost any of our native species. Garlic mustards in the woods, it blankets the woods. It smothers out everything else. It's one of our little invader friends. Other plants are moving. Some of them are native invasives and some are aliens. You've got Phragmites, you've got canary grass, and a variety of others. This is a roadside ditch along one of the interstates. It's wet down there. We should be able to grow native wetland moist soil plants here. Instead, we're growing these things, and my friends at Natural History say it's also a breeding ground for Aedes vexans, which is a rather nasty biting mosquito. It's not just plants we have to worry about. This is an Asian planarian called Bipalum adventitium. It eats earthworms. I find 3 or 4 in my yard every year. In Ireland, either this species or closely related species had just about extirpated earthworms from a large part of Ireland. They're becoming established here. I think they were first found in 1990. But imagine what's going to happen to our soil if our earthworms are killed out by these critters. Google this if you want to see some really gross feeding behavior. Another thing to think about, we've just spent a lot of time cluttering up our air. You know, Illinois Power and the other folks that deal with power lines and rights-of-way, they want everything underground now. People like things underground because it's not in the way, trees don't fall on the power lines, etc. But I'm beginning to wonder after seeing flags, and this is the best I could find Saturday, but I've seen places where someone's entire yard or most of an intersection is covered with flags. What that means is it's much, much more expensive to try and put a new line underground. Now, some of the cable companies, they just roll their cable out on top of the gravel I showed you earlier in a new subdivision and put the sod right on top of it. They're not supposed to do that, but they do. But what I'm suggesting is we need to start thinking seriously about some type of rules for where you put the lines so that they're not scattered all over the place. So we might have little corridors to the house where most of the utilities can go in an area maybe 6 feet wide instead of the phone company going across north to south and cable company coming east to west in a diagonal pattern, etc. But I think the cities are going to find, if they haven't already, that doing any kind of work on sewers and other utilities is going to become much more expensive in the future as the underground environment becomes more cluttered. One of the worst features of our underground environment is that the companies installing them frequently use a trencher, leave the subsoil on top, and then you get into erosion situations. This is Macoupin County again. We're not going to blame Champaign here, but they've put in a huge amount of underground electrical utilities in Macoupin County, and whoever did it didn't do squat to put the land back together. The subsoil's on top. It's basically trenched, and there's tremendous erosion in some of these areas. It's just something that shouldn't happen. We basically need a law that say the topsoil goes on top. Even if it's a little more expensive in the short term, it'll benefit us in the long run. Here's a high security facility in southeast Urbana. You might think that we're trying to protect that substation from Al-Qaeda. In fact, we're trying to protect it from squirrels. I don't know what this sucker cost, but this is a prototype designed for a squirrel-proof utility. You know how often our squirrels knock out our utilities? The point of this slide is that we, as a society, have got ourselves into a situation where we're trying to be environmental, we're trying to be animal-friendly, we're trying to restore things. When I was a kid, deer were unusual in Illinois. It was a big deal if you saw one. Today, after managing deer since the 30s to try and bring them back, we have more deer than we ever had in the state in the past. They're a nuisance now. Squirrels are a nuisance. Rabbits are a nuisance. You know, the crows are gone for the most part. People have to leash their dogs. So squirrels and rabbits are taking off. But are we going to be doing this for most of our friendly little species? We need a public policy and a public that's educated enough to realize that we have to kill deer if we're going to maintain an environment. Deer in this state are destroying a large number of our native plants. They go through the woods and eat everything off. And I run out of time, didn't have enough time to do all my slides on it. I was in Meadowbrook Park one day, about 10 years ago, and I was walking through there, not Meadowbrook, Busey Woods. I saw like 500 trillium in full bloom right from where I was standing. I brought my kids back the next weekend. I didn't see 1 trillium. I couldn't figure out what was going on, and I started looking, and there were 500 or 600 little stems that had been chomped off by the deer. You can see 10 or 20 deer in Meadowbrook Park whenever you want to in the evening. We have to start managing these things. We have a great environmental success story in that we brought back certain types of geese, we've brought back beaver, we've brought back deer, we're bringing back turkey. We've got a great management plan to bring them back, but no idea of how we're going to control them. And if we don't start doing that, we're going to have some huge problems. I live in Urbana. I used to live right in the middle of the city. We had deer in our backyard twice. And now I'm a little closer to Meadowbrook Park, and all of our hydrangeas and other non-native plants were eaten by deer this spring. So this is an issue. Here's another thing to think about. We're in this big energy kick. Now, if you go back about 10 years, all over the Midwest, people were spending lots and lots of money they didn't have to build corn-based ethanol plants. After studying it for a while, letting it mature and thinking about it, we pretty much decided corn-based ethanol, though it's an important addition to our way to work on our energy problems, it's not the final solution. And I think a lot of these companies have gone bankrupt. Well, windmills, or turbines I guess they want to call them, are now the darling. I've got nothing against turbines. They're probably a good idea, but we don't have any idea what effect they're going to have in vast quantities. There are currently plans to put a line of turbines from somewhere in Indiana all the way across Illinois, almost blade to blade, on into Iowa and up, I think they go as far as Nebraska because of the way the wind works, and the old moraines ended up. There's incipient research at the surveys which show that bats are particularly vulnerable to these things because as they spin, they set up a negative air pressure that basically sucks the lungs out of the bats as they fly by. They don't hit them. They give them a nasty equivalent of the bends. If you're up by Streeter or Pawpaw in the evening or at night, the entire horizon in some areas is dominated by flashing red lights. I mean, practically horizon to horizon. Is this a good idea? So what I'm saying is not that we don't need any of these things, but we're on a dead heat rush to build lots of them without knowing what effect they might have on migratory birds, monarchs, bats, and a whole lot of other critters, not to mention people. So I know a lot of farmers that live near these who are quite upset by both noise and flicker. And of course, I used to be chairman of the Pollution Control Board, and I can assure you that the worst things to deal with are noise, odor, and annoyances, because people's threshold varies dramatically, just as your threshold for flu. But we need to do things in moderation and make sure we understand what we're getting into before we go too far, just like that plan the Corps of Engineers and Soil Conservation Service had to improve most of our rivers. Soil Conservation Service is now called the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Their motto was, and perhaps still is, hold the raindrop where it falls. This is one thing we need to think seriously about for sustainability. We have a rain barrel program in much of the state now, and we're starting to build rain gardens. Now, a rain garden is very much along the line, as is a rain barrel, of hold the raindrop where it falls, let the water soak into the ground. If you're a rain barrel, use it when you need it. It's not going to solve all our flood problems, but it'll take the edge off and probably do it for not too much money, and that's important. So these type of concepts are things I think we need to start thinking about when we deal with the local issues. Now, other people in disciplines are dealing with and fixing up houses for energy and things like that. All these things are complementary. But when we deal with our environment and our future, we need to think like engineers and biologists and economists, etc., and not just do the easiest thing. And we can't just do what's pretty. You talk to some people, they want pretty plants. Well, a lot of the pretty plants have a huge bloom because somebody bred out much of the pollen and nectar. So the plant puts its energy into making a big flower. That might be pretty, but it defeats the ecological purpose of the flower. You can carry that analogy around. So I think I'll stop there, and I'll take whatever questions we have. And if people want to run and then do questions, we can do that also.
Thank you very much, John. Do we have some questions?
Yeah. You think about you showed some farmers' ditches and talked about how it might be a good idea not to mow those. How do you keep the wrong things from filling that space?
You can burn it periodically. Like a lot of the prairie areas, if you burn them once every 3 years, you'll keep down the woody and other things. Mowing at certain times of the year works fine. It's never an all or nothing. We in this country, we tend to go all or nothing. But it's really the mixture that holds the environment together. A little bit of everything. Invasive species, it'd be a good idea to try and root them out if you can. But basically different situations will take different things. We had our own little ecological problem out here with an invasive thistle that got into our wildflower plantings here, and it's very hard to get rid of. You've all seen that happen. One other thing I should mention, particularly those people who deal with grounds and facilities and highways, is you should do your mowing, if you're going to do it, after things like milkweed have let their seeds go. So I've just been driving around the state recently, and I noticed the milkweed is getting ready to release, as are a bunch of other plants. Highway department's out there mowing. They have no idea, really, what they're doing in terms of the ecology. Nobody's bothered to tell them because they're engineers and et cetera, and the biologists are over here and the engineers over there, and they're bitching at each other. They need to talk. And these little white flowers you see around campus. Last year, I saw 9 butterflies on one little aster bush about this big and about 15 honeybees. And I thought, boy, this is pretty cool, because there wasn't another plant within 100 yards. And I went to take a video of it the next day, and F&S had already come by with their weed whacker and whacked it. This is the time of the year the queen bumblebees are loading up with nectar to get through the winter. Butterflies are tanking up to either finish whatever they're going to do, fly south or hibernate or get their eggs finished. And when we cut down the plants just before they make seed or just when the critical insects need them, we're doing ourselves a big disservice. And it's catching up with us because there's less and less of the native species out there in any quantity. And we got to do something different. We have to educate our kids so they're not afraid of bugs. And our parents too. Yes?
John, some new subdivisions have covenants that specify that a yard needs to be sodded when the house is built. This leads to the inability of a landowner to do some of the things you're talking about. How do we change the process where new developments have these kinds of restrictive covenants in them?
Well, first thing was we probably have to talk to some of the developers, but then most condo and other associations have the ability to change their bylaws. I believe people have a presumptive right to do certain things with their property, and it's illegal for a club or golf course to discriminate against blacks, Jews, Hispanics, women. The same principle might very well apply to certain functions in these subdivisions. You got to remember the subdivisions by and large today are not being put together by people who are going to live there. They're being put together by people who are trying in very difficult economic times to squeeze every dime they can out of the property. And one way to do that is to scrape all the soil, put back as little as possible, do as little amenities as possible. I've had women come to me and say, John, when we were doing the final contract, we asked about topsoil, and the contractor said, lady, do you want your granite countertops or do you want your topsoil? If you want them both, you're going to have to buy the topsoil back. I mean, I think people have a right to be able to grow a carrot in central Illinois if they buy a house. I mean, how many people, when they look at that nice green grass, when they buy a new house, a new subdivision, are aware that there might only be an inch of soil, if that much, under there? When they go to plant their first tree, they find out. When they go to plant a flower, they find out. But then it's too late. And their worms are gone. And the soil bacteria are gone. And the ants are gone. Everything you need to have a nice, healthy yard is gone. And what do your kids get to play with then? They can't chase bugs. Except for Japanese beetles and those horrid aphid-eating coccinellids, the orange ladybug, which was brought in because we had an alien invasive aphid that the orange bug was brought in to eat. And the orange invasive, or the aphid, which eats the soybeans, has an alternate host, which is another non-native invasive plant that was brought in. So we have 3 non-natives causing huge problems, and they're all brought to us by somebody else. So, yes?
I've heard from several sources that in the corporate world there's interest in converting their campus lawns into prairie. They're actually, some of the consultants that install these sort of restored prairies told me that the payback is like 3 years. The money they save from mowing, it pays for the prairie restoration in about a 3-year period.
Yeah, I believe that's true. In fact, I was representing the governor for the Governor's Pollution Prevention Awards at the opening of one of those facilities at Tellabs, and their entire campus was in prairie plants. And the light switch plates were specially made with a prairie grass design coming out, kind of like Bugs Bunny would be on a kid's bedroom switch plate. These people had prairie switch plates. So yes, that's happening, but it's happening on a limited basis. We need the power companies nationally to put native plants, low growing, in their power line right-of-ways, for example, and their pipeline right-of-ways. They have to be maintained so the trees don't grow there. Well, it's a good place to grow low plants, and highways, and schools. How many schools around here have acres and acres of grass? How many big box churches have acres and acres of grass? And speaking of the weird big box, we need laws that say if you build a big box store and take 5 acres and turn it into a parking lot and scrape away all the topsoil, you have to keep that soil piled up somewhere. So if you change your stores like they did in Champaign and Urbana, somebody can dig up the parking lot and put the soil material back down, and even though the bacteria aren't there right away, you can get things to grow again. You know, some of these subdivisions have covenants that say you cannot remove topsoil from the subdivision, some of the older ones. The University of Illinois allegedly has a similar policy: you cannot remove topsoil from campus. I have not seen that enforced, but I'm told it exists. I don't have time to go look it up.